Hi team, welcome to Nutrition Video Lecture 4. This is the final in the macronutrient series, and it is of course fat, as you can see on the screen here. Through this lecture, we're going to be looking at the different types of fat that we can derive from food, what happens to it once it enters our body. We'll also look at the functions of fat within the body, and of course its relevance to exercise as well going forward. So, what is fat? Fat is part of a class of compounds known as lipids, and they take many forms within the body. Probably the most common form is a stored form of fat, and that can be stored around our organs or most commonly under our skin, and that's known as triglycerides. It can be in a more usable form, something the muscles can burn, for example, called fatty acids. It can also make up components of various cells, particularly the outer cell membrane. Those ones are known as phospholipids. It is found in the form of cholesterols, both good and bad, within the body, and of course floating in our bloodstream as lipoproteins. So, just like carbs, the organic compounds that make up fat are molecules of carbohydrate, hydrogen, and oxygen. But there's a couple of differentiating points between the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules that make fat and the same molecules that make carbohydrates, and we will get on to them shortly. So triglycerides, as mentioned, the most common form of fat in the body, and they come in lots of different shapes and sizes, but they all share one common structure, and that is they always contain a molecule of glycerol, which is kind of like a jelly type substance. And then they have three fatty acid chains that attach to that molecule of glycerol. And those fatty acid chains can vary in length and the degree that they're saturated with hydrogen, but essentially they all have the same components. The amount of saturation of the chemical hydrogen is what differentiates the fats in terms of being saturated or unsaturated. We'll discuss more on that now. So saturated fats is a term that a lot of people would have heard of before. It's often got bad connotations associated with it because it does have a link to the bad cholesterol that clogs up our arteries internally. It's usually found, as you can see in the pictures there, in animal products and can also be found obviously in processed type foods too. So what makes them saturated, as mentioned before, is the level of hydrogen saturation that occurs within its chemical structure. So certain saturated fats are known to increase your total blood cholesterol, and these are usually a waxy type substance that lays down on the inner wall of arteries, and through a process of trying to rid the internal surface of the artery wall of this waxy substance, white blood cells will actually penetrate that saturated fat into the wall of the artery itself, and that's where problems can arise, as I'll show you in some video footage soon. Stearic acid, the example that's shown here, is soap. That's obviously old school soap, bar soap, which is effectively a type of saturated fat with perfume in it, a bit of pig fat with perfume. In the old school sense of soap. So that's the same kind of waxiness that old bar of soap has when it's been wet a few times is pretty similar to what's clogging up our arteries, etc. So this shows the chemical makeup of a saturated fat sort of molecule. We've got the carbon atoms through the middle here, these black atoms here, and just as a simple analogy for saturated fat to show you the difference, I guess, in chemical format between a saturated and unsaturated fat. If you imagine that we're looking at a car park here, and the carbon molecules are the available car parks, these black ones here, you can see in a saturated fat that every car park space is full with a hydrogen molecule here. So these carbon atoms are completely saturated with hydrogen atoms. There are no spare spaces available for any more hydrogen to attach. That's what gives it its term saturated. Now what that means for a saturated fat is it's typically solid at room temperature. The degree of saturation makes it somewhat solid. So an example of that hydrogen state is where you take a vegetable oil and you hydrogenate it. So hydrogenated fats are where you take a liquid fat and essentially bubble hydrogen through it at a set temperature and it solidifies. So these things already have that level of hydrogen saturation and therefore are usually visible at room temperature as solid white streaks, and you can see them in the meat down the bottom here. And the good news about that is that that's really easy to dispose of. So meats are actually a mixture of all fatty acids, probably predominantly saturated and monounsaturated, but you could make a meat far less saturated by simply removing the visible white fat either prior to the time of cooking or after the cooking has occurred. The only two vegetable fats that would be considered saturated fats in common use are things like coconut and palm oil. And you might have heard some bad things about palm oil, but that's mainly from a deforestation sort of aspect, but also eaten in too many amounts could cause the same problems as these white saturated fats of meat, etc. And you're usually going to find it visible underneath the skin of the animals and the meat that we eat. So if you have a cut of meat that has skin on top, you can imagine there's going to be saturated fat under that, just like there would be on a human. And in these oil versions here, if you were to sit them at room temperature, they would solidify somewhat. You'd see a sort of white waxy substance form on top of the oil, and again, easily removed. So there we see some pretty clear examples of saturated fat here. Now, common sources, these are things that you'll need to highlight or know where to find for your first assessment, the open book test. These are some good examples here. All animal meats essentially will have some form. Poultry will have it particularly under the skin, and then whole milk dairy products or anything made from full fat dairy would have an amount of saturated fat in it too. Butter and cheese being the obvious dense versions of that. So what's the problem with it? The problem is that the type of cholesterol that is derived from saturated fats, and again coming from foods of mainly animal origin, is dangerous to the walls of our arteries. It's a smooth, waxy substance, and it is important in the body. It's what we actually make our sex hormones out of, our steroid hormones. So it is really vital to have some saturated fat in the diet, but when we have too much, we have this bad cholesterol known as low-density lipoprotein, and represented by the yellow dots here, forms a sort of plaquey, waxy layer on the inside wall of this nice artery that you see there. Okay, now the problem with that, as I've said, is that's going to start to narrow the artery and cause inflammation and changes to the wall of that artery that eventually could lead to an artery rupture, the inside wall of that rupturing and the gooey, waxy sort of parts spilling out. And at that point, the platelets in your blood, the things that go around looking for cuts and ruptures, would come in and actually try to clot that leaking wall. And it's the clot itself that might effectively fill up this whole space here, and that would prevent, of course, blood getting through. And if that's going to somewhere like your brain, you'd suffer a stroke, or if it was going to your heart muscle, you'd suffer a cardiac arrest at that point, or a heart attack. So one of the biggest killers, effectively, in Western society is this laden of plaque and cholesterol, and that's why doctors will often test cholesterol. So that extra cholesterol, like I said, deposited in the artery wall is plaque, and it leads to narrowing of the arteries. And angina, if you're unfamiliar with that one, is the initial pain that you get because of the narrowed artery and the lack of oxygen getting through to the heart muscle. And then, of course, a full blockage would be a heart attack, and a blockage in the brain would be considered a stroke. And the blunt reality is that if blood can't get through, that part of that organ dies. So the two types of cholesterol are LDLs and HDLs, and one is very, very good for us, and one is not so good in large amounts. The low-density lipoproteins carry the waxy type cholesterol through the blood and deposited in the cells and in the artery walls, whereas the HDLs, the high-density lipoproteins, pick up this waxy type cholesterol that's been deposited and take it back to the liver, and we can process it and remove it. So really what you're looking for is increasing levels of HDLs over LDLs, and that will ensure that you don't lay down large amounts of plaque on the walls of the arteries. And if you do lay any down, then good levels of HDLs will come around and clean it up before it's absorbed into the wall of the artery and causes its big problems. So usually when cholesterol is measured, we're looking at a ratio between HDL and LDL, and of course we want to see higher levels of the HDLs. The next question, of course, is where do you get the HDLs from? We know the low density lipoproteins come from saturated fat, and you can probably guess that there's only a couple of fats left, and they're unsaturated fats, and that of course is where the HDLs come from. So to improve cholesterol, reduce known LDLs by eating less saturated fats, going lower fat in the dairy aisle, picking out leaner cuts of meat, removing the obvious fat from meat, and potentially even the skin from chicken. I don't know about the prior to cooking, maybe after, would keep a few of the juices in. Cakes, pastries, and anything made with butter would be another key source that could be removed of saturated fats. And then try to eat some good oils, which are the mono and polyunsaturated fats, but particularly monos seem to have a heart-preserving effect. They have good high levels of the high-density lipoproteins, and you can see there's some examples there: nuts, avocado, olive oil, oily fish, etc. are all good examples of them. Smoking is also thought to play a role in the hardening and layering of cholesterol in the arteries, as is salt, which we'll talk about in a bit as well, which is more involved in hardening arteries. And of course, exercise is a good way of ensuring that we don't lay down too much fat anyway. We can utilize it for exercise and recovery rather than having large amounts of it floating around our body unused. So, just skipped over a little video there. I'm not going to show the videos in this video lecture here. You can look at the full Prezi and have a look at that, but that video I just skipped over shows the arteriosclerosis, or the blockage occurring within an artery wall. And feel free to have a look at it on the Moodle page and the FATS full Prezi. Alright, so let's have a look at those unsaturated fats now. As mentioned before, monounsaturated fats, good heart tick sort of fats. And you can see there, probably no surprise to you, things like avocado. Most people are familiar with that being full of good oils. Olive oil is probably the densest form of monounsaturated fat, and you've got some almonds down there and some peanut butter as well. So nuts and natural oils from plant-based sources. Now, the difference between them chemically, as we'll see in a moment, is there are some spare car parts available in the old carbon car park. So, having a look there, you can see that not all of the carbon molecules have been attached with a hydrogen molecule. So we have some spaces along the chain. So this is the chain of fatty acid that we talk about that would be attached to the glycerol molecule, and along its length of different portions you can see there's one double bond that occurs here and a couple of spare parking spaces, and that's what dictates it being unsaturated. So they're known as good fats. They come from plant and seafood sources, and they actively lower the low density lipoprotein cholesterols and thus help you reduce your cardiovascular risk. There's some great examples, so you just need to be aware of some of them for the test. And then that leaves, of course, the other type of fat, the polyunsaturated fats. And as you can guess, if monounsaturated meant one double bond with some spare car parts, then polyunsaturated fats are obviously multiple double bonds along the length of the fatty acid chain. And, of course, that means more free car parks. These are the guys that you probably know of as omegas, omega-6, omega-3. And they are essential fatty acids that the body can't make or derive, so we need to get them in our diet. And this is a common area where people are lacking in these polyunsaturated fats, because a lot of people don't fancy fish, particularly the sort of oily fishes that are rich in these polyunsaturated fats. So a lot of people instead will go for the easier option, which is the fish oil tablets. There we see, along the length of the fatty acid chain here, a couple of double bonds, more free parking spaces, and that's what dictates the name polyunsaturated. You can see there where the double bonds occur is, or how often they occur, dictates whether it's an omega-3 or omega-6. You can see 1, 2, 3 single bonds there before the double bond occurs, and then 1, 2, 3 single bonds and the double bond. That's a omega-3, and then this one has 6 single bonds before the double bond arrives, making it an omega-6. Sources of omega-6 there: seeds, soy, corn oils, and they're also known as good fats and can lower those LDLs. And then the omega-3s are the ones that we usually associate with the oily fish. You can see their mustard and walnuts in there as well, and the good old canola oil, which is I guess the cheap alternative to olive oil. Science is ongoing about what the actual function of these omegas are. What they do know is that in countries in populations where there isn't a sufficient intake of these things, there is more growth issues, more reproductive issues, and more kidney issues. So the presumption is that they have a role in those things there. They may also be indicated with helping your immunity and warding off illness and certain cancers and cardiovascular disease, as well as common skin complaints. So a lot of research going into these things. The hard thing is to separate them essentially from the vitamin and mineral content that's found with them as well, to know that it is the omegas and not the other things that are causing these beneficial effects. But regardless of that, good to eat, and something that your body can definitely benefit from. So there's a wee table, types of fat. You can see the fat, different types there. Harmful dietary fat, you see saturated, and we must stress that means in too much amounts. The monos and polys are always considered good, but of course if you eat too much of these good fat containing foods as well, you may have too many calories in the diet, with fat being 9 calories per gram. Doesn't mean you can just eat all the avocado you like, and you certainly shouldn't sit around drinking, glasses of olive oil either. You'll also notice this guy here, trans fats. This is definitely the worst of all. Okay, so while we would say eat saturated fat in moderation, trans fat we should try and cut out of the diet altogether. You can see that it's found in hydrogenated vegetable oils, things that we've taken and turned into a solid. So we're talking margarines, shortening, and those kind of things. It's probably also used because it's very cheap. Vegetable oil, much cheaper than expensive meat fats, and things like pastries and pies, commercial cakes, biscuits, and of course anything that's deep fried. They're not going to use beef talon anymore, or anything that comes from actual expensive animal fats. It's going to be your cheaper bog standard vegetable oil, and that process of deep frying will effectively hydrogenate that oil. That stuff is real dangerous, because your body, while it can recognize that as saturated fat, because we effectively have that under the skin in our bodies, it has no clue what this chemically altered fat is or what it's for. And it's been indicated in some really serious incidences of cholesterol raising, and of course visceral fat around your organs and interpenetrating organs. So we should definitely be on the lookout for trans fats in the types of foods that I've mentioned there. Okay. So, yep, there's the wee breakdown of the trans fats there. We're basically talking about an oil that's had hydrogen bubbled through it until it's solidified, and while it has some benefits for manufacturers in terms of shelf life and that kind of thing, it's not really viewed as a natural fat. Most baking and convenience foods have some trans fats, but actually our margarines in New Zealand are not too bad. They've got some pretty regulated laws around trans fat use in those. But it's more about anything to be really bad for you in terms of cakes and pastries from mass-produced places, along with things like corn chips and other forms of chips and those kind of things that have been deep fried. You can expect that there's going to be trans fats in there, and it all adds up. So this little video I'm clicking over if you want to know more about trans fats and see a wee breakdown of the different types of fats in a video format. Feel free to have a look at that one. So, what does fat do for us? Well, we saw that carbs is basically energy. We saw that protein has a range of different functions in the body, and so does fat. It is our largest energy storage in the human body. We all have more than we probably need, it's fair to say. It's an insulator, so it does keep you warm, and if you have very low body fat percentages, you will feel the cold a lot more and find it harder to retain body heat. It protects areas that don't have bony protection, so we tend to lay it down where the body thinks it may not have enough muscular protection or bone protection, and obviously belly fat's a classic example of that. If you haven't got a good and strong functioning core set, then your body may try to offer some extra padding, let's say, to your squishy underbelly, and pad it out with some fat. All cells of the body, the outer membrane layer is effectively sat. Anything that needs thickening within the body, whether it be snot or other liquids, etc., would be emulsified using fat. and it is also a source of our fat-soluble vitamins. In fact, they are forms of lipids, these vitamins, and we'll talk about them in a later micronutrient lecture. But the fat-soluble vitamins, if you're wondering, are vitamins D, E, K, and A. So what happens when we chuck it in our mouth? We obviously chew it and break it down, try to separate it from the other macronutrients like carbs and protein. And then the real action really starts when it gets to the stomach, and of course we mix it with the acids within the stomach and water, and we start to try and break it down into sort of absorbable units. The liver will also aid this, so often once it's come out of the gut, it's still not in a state that will easily absorb into the bloodstream. So the liver produces bile, which then goes is a very strong acid, which comes out and really goes to work on those fat molecules. By the time we get to the large intestine with food, fat and cholesterol, the only fat and cholesterol you're going to see in the large intestine ready for exit is anything that's been trapped in fibre. Unfortunately, many high fat foods don't have a lot of fibre, so a lot of it is going to actually enter our system rather than get pooed out the other end, so to speak. So like I said, it's pretty dense fat. 9 calories per gram means it is quite a dense unit of energy, and that means we don't really want huge amounts of it floating around the bloodstream. And even after one meal, there can be considerable increase in the amount of fat floating around your bloodstream. The smaller molecules go straight through the small intestine wall, just like the carbs and protein did, and are absorbed, taken off the liver, and then released into the bloodstream. Whereas the larger and denser molecules that aren't ready to be put into the bloodstream are actually packed into chylomicrons, which move into your lymphatic system, which is a network of fluid vessels that run alongside blood vessels, but not they don't house blood or have blood running through them. And there they can go pretty much straight off to places of storage, so it may go straight to the old hips or bum or wherever you tend to store fat as part of your genetic predisposition. So this picture here is showing these large droplets of fat, the smaller ones going through the intestinal walls. Here's the villi of the intestinal wall here, but the larger ones getting packed away into the lymphatic system, and away they go to your wobbly part storage areas. This picture, all I want to show you there, we'll just talk through this sort of process here, is this bit here where less than 5% of fat is normally excreted in your feces, which means if you have a massive fat blowout, it's staying in you. And unless you are prepared to do something to get rid of that, then it's going to stay on your wobbly bits and basically sit there for all time until you encourage the body to start using it. And we'll talk about how we do that soon. 3 places of storage you need to be aware of. So this is an important slide. You can highlight this guy in your notes. 3 places, obviously under your skin, is body fat, so that's subcutaneous, under skin adipose tissue, and also more dangerously visceral deposits which are found around your organs. So it actually not only wraps around your organs and is stored in the fascial spaces around organs like your kidneys and liver, etc., but it can actually interpenetrate your organs as well when things get really bad and affect the function of them. We do find fat stored in the muscle as intramuscular triglycerides, which is good because that means that they're available to use as fuel in the right circumstances. And as mentioned, they provide the outer layer for virtually every cell of the body. So how much should we be eating? What should we be eating? Let's have a look. Total fat intake, surprisingly, and a lot of people see this figure and go, wow, really? 30%? More than protein. Protein, if you remember, was somewhere between 12 and 20% of an average person's intake, whereas fat can be up to 30% of energy intake. It's mainly a reflection of the fact that it has double and more the calorie content of protein. So it's not like you eat twice as much fat. You actually eat slightly less fat than protein, but it yields twice as many calories, which therefore makes up twice as many percentage points on the total energy intake. Probably best to have a mixture of saturated fats and the good fats. Probably aim for about 2/3 unsaturated to 1/3 or slightly less saturated fat. How are we doing? Average New Zealand intake is about 33% fat, men roughly eating about 95 grams a day and women 67 grams a day. A good guideline would be about a gram per kilo of body weight a day if you're happy with the amount of body weight you have. So on an 80 kilo man, about 80 grams a day would be a good starting point. Females obviously being a little bit lower. Body weight on average, you'd be looking at a 60 kilo woman having 60 grams. So the average being 95 grams suggests that we're probably overeating, because I don't know if we'd be happy with the average population member male being 95 kilos. It's probably tipping the scales a bit high. And again, woman at 67. Well, I'll let you be the judge of that one. So as a starting point, when thinking about allocating the amount of fat to a person, you can see here on this table, this is quite general, and I'm going to show you a much more specific way of dealing with things here that's more relevant to the size of an individual that you're dealing with. So I don't like these blanket sort of numbers that we throw about. The only one that I'd actually take any notice of in this one here is a low-fat diet. So if we determine that a person needed to lose a meaningful amount of weight and they wanted to do it and kickstart that process pretty quickly, then it would be suggested that cutting back on fat quite dramatically would be a good starting point there. And I typically would look at about that 40 gram range as being a doable sort of amount. So that kind of sets a calorie intake of 360 calories per day based on 40 grams of fat times 9 calories there. Alright, so that's probably the only thing I'd pull out of this, but what you can see is that women typically need less than men, and that teenagers and active children can get away with a bit more because of their active, growing sort of body. And then if you're a really active athlete or very active worker, you get even more again. But such a small range between 80 and 100 doesn't really take into account things like, what if it's a 52 kilo woman versus a 110 kilo man? That can't be the range. So I'm going to give you a better way of deciding. First things first, if a person is happy to maintain their current body fat levels, then you work on a 1 gram per kilo basis, okay, so as mentioned before. If a slight body fat reduction is a goal, this is really common, let's be honest, with most of us, even people that are pretty thin to look at, were to be honest with ourselves and say, could we do with reducing a little bit of body fat, or would that be desirable? Then the answer is probably yes. Then what you can do is decrease that by up to about 15%. That's a decrease of 15% below the 1 gram per kilo marker there. The easiest way to do that is to take the 15% off the 1 gram figure, which would make it 0.85 times your current kilos, and that would start a small reduction in fat that would hopefully over time start to reduce a little bit of body fat, because it would create a slight calorie deficit. So a lot of people would probably work off this 0.85 figure rather than the 1 gram if we're honest with ourselves. So that's pretty easy, really. You ask yourself one of 3 things. Am I happy maintaining my current level of body fat? Yes, I am. 1 gram per kilo. Probably up to a maximum of 100, to be fair. If you're, a big athletic dude that's in the 15s or 120 kegs, probably about 100 grams from carbs should be sufficient for just about anyone. It would make up the rest of our calories in a more usable form in terms of carbs and protein. So, the next question is to ask, well, no, would you like to lose a little bit of weight? And if the answer is yeah, maybe a couple of kegs of body fat would be good to lose, regardless of whether you're trying to gain muscle or not, then maybe that 0.85 figure is the right one for you, times your body weight. And then if you want to lose a significant amount of weight, let's say 7+ kilos, then maybe going on a lower fat diet of that 40 gram figure is probably important. And really important to note, I'll just pop back, when you take that figure here off the table at 40 grams, that's not 40 grams per kilo, obviously. This is just 40 grams you're allowed to eat. And that would be times by 9, and that would be your calories there. Whereas over here, that's 1 gram times your kilograms. So again, an 85 kilo male, 85 grams, we would then times that by 9, and that would be your calories. Or we would go 0.85 grams times 85 if this person wanted to lose a couple of kegs. And of course, we'd times that by the kilos, and then times 9, because that would work out the calories. So we'll be doing more on these calculations pretty soon, guys, so that's just a little intro. Alright, what else is useful for a client to know? It's really useful for them to know how to look at a label and make a decision on whether this is the right type of food for them to be eating, depending on what their goal is. First thing they have to be aware of is they have to know that each label has the calories in terms of energy stated per serve, and that's only relevant if that's what you're going to eat. You know, a big bag of chips with its 7.5 serves, is that realistic, or do you actually smash all of those in one go? Therefore, you'd have to times everything on the label by 7.5 to get an accurate reading. So, fat is not created equally, as we mentioned with the other macronutrients. Remember, it's 9 calories per gram versus 4 calories per gram for carbs and 4 calories per gram for protein. So one thing I like to say to people to do, without having to pull out the calculator like we're doing over here, is just probably a truer indication of the calorie containment of a packaged product like this, is mentally double the fat value. So if we look at these values here of 37 grams of carbs, 8 grams of fat, and 3 grams of protein, it doesn't look too bad from the sort of pie graph approach we've been talking about, where we look at 50 to 65% carbohydrate, that 12 to 20% protein, and up to 30% fat we just talked about. But if we double that mentally, because we know it's worth 9 calories instead of 4 with these other guys here, that takes it up to 16. Okay, now 16 is a long way from 3, and it shows you that fat is a much bigger player in this food product than the 8 grams that is stated there. And of course, if this was a 100 gram product, that 8 grams would look like 8 out of 100, meaning it's 92% fat free. 92% fat free doesn't sound too bad. Okay, but actually, that figure based off weight is wholly inaccurate, because the product that you're looking at might include water, and water, of course, adds weight, and water, of course, has no calories. So if we actually look at the physical components of this food here, you've got your 37 grams of carbs, which they've added fiber and sugar as part of that. You've got 3 grams of protein, which we add to 37, makes that 40 grams of product. And then 8 grams of fat, which is 48 grams of product. Now, there's nothing else physical that can add weight to this product. So only 48 grams are accounted for out of, let's say, 100 grams of product. What's the rest? It's water. So to get a truer indication, we need to turn it into calories. So we go 8 times 9 is 72. So you see over here, calories per gram, 9. Total fat calories, 8 grams times 9 is 72. Now, if I told you that this was a 90 calorie product, then 90 calories, 72 of those are coming from fat. Now, does that sound like a 92% fat-free product? The answer is, of course, not. It's actually an 80% fat product. And I don't think anyone's going to be advertising 20% fat-free. So we've got to be savvy when it comes to teaching our clients about how to read labels and what they're actually reading. Okay, manufacturers are forever going to try and pull the wool over our eyes. So, more to come on labelling. That's just a little taster. We'll do a little bit more in this lesson on some takeaway foods in a moment, but later on in the nutrition course we'll be covering labelling and some key hints and things that you can pass on to your clients in more detail. So, kiwis. How do we get on and where do we get our fat from? Principal sources of fat still come from butter and margarine. So this is from a census from 2011, the most recent one I could lay my hands on. So 16% of total fat intakes in New Zealand come from butter and margarine. We'll talk more about that in a second. 6% come from things cooked in fat or beef or dripping or that kind of stuff. And then your milk and your cakes and your muffins with their butter, etc. all give you about 6%, along with just straight meat products that we eat. Then you got your pies and pastries and bread type dishes and stuff like that, your sammies and that kind of stuff, all giving you about 5%, along with the processed meats and sausages. But it's that butter and margarine fat that is actually good news in a sense, because fat added to food in the forms of sauces, mayos, butter and other condiments contributes 25% of your total fat intake in New Zealand. 44% of that figure is margarine and butter, so we're just dolloping it on. And why is that good news? Because it's so easy to remove. If 25% of your fat intake could be reduced simply by changing what you put on food after you've cooked it, then that's actually a good thing. It's not hidden away out of sight in the foods that we're eating. We're actually consciously daubing it onto our foods once it's been cooked. So we need to find either low-fat forms of those sauces that still have taste, and everyone complains that it doesn't taste as good when it doesn't have fat, and that's true, but it only takes your body a number of days to adjust to a taste. Your taste buds will adjust, And I can't tell you how many people when Diet Coke first came out said they would never touch another can of it. It tasted awful. And now I know people that will never go back and drink a full-fat Coke because they don't like the taste. So your taste buds will change, no question. And that's good news. It means we can look at those condiments that we're eating and just go, right, we need to look at the back of these condiments and see how much fat's in them, and then we can dramatically reduce our calorie intake. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we know where our high intakes of fat are coming from. You either know that you're actively seeking out good oils to put into your diet, like nuts and avocados and stuff, or you know that you're eating a bunch of crap and it's laden with fat. What's the problem with having a continually high-fat type diet? Well, number one is there are huge links between high-fat diets and obesity just simply because of excessive calorie intake. We've already talked about the links between cholesterol and saturated fat, and that relates also to hypertension because narrower arteries mean the heart has to work harder to pump the thicker, fattier blood through the body. We've talked about the heart disease issues, and just to give you another visual of a blocked artery, on the left here we have a nice wide open artery space for blood to flow through, and on the right here that's been reduced down to this little white squished sort of opening here. And all of this here is the build-up of fatty plaque that's found within that wall. Now, I'm suggesting that this person's either dead or is in a very bad state when this internal sort of picture was taken. Can there be any benefits to eating high amounts of fat? Yeah, if you're eating good fats, and you're coming in under your calorie requirements, then diets high in omegas have been proven to have very good preservation tendencies for the cardiovascular system, in particular by lowering those cholesterol levels and reducing the thickness of your blood, which reduces the tendency to clot. What about going low fat? Well, there's something we should talk about here. There's an abundance of low fat products that have been offered when fat was talked about as the enemy, and things have moved onto sugar more recently. But the problem is when you take out fat from a product, you've got to fill the volume of the product with something, and typically they move to sugar when they do that. So just because something's low fat doesn't mean it's healthy. All right, so we've got to make that distinction too. And this is where everyday people throw their hands up and say it's all too hard and I'll just eat whatever. All right, so healthy body weights are typically more associated with low fat diets. The one thing you've got to watch out a little bit for is that vitamin absorption, because you only get these vitamins A, D, E, and K from fat-containing foods, and they can only absorb with fat and be stored in fat. So there could be a suggestion that maybe vitamin absorption won't happen the way it should. However, because they're stored in body fat, when you do eat these, you can store amounts of these vitamins in your body for periods of months at a time. So you would have to be deficient in those vitamins for a decent period of time before some problems were starting to arise. Alright, so we go back to the sort of discussions we had before in carbs and protein around how much we're supposed to have of each of these macros. Now we have sort of a more complete picture, 50 to 65% carbs. Now bear in mind, this is for a person of a relatively healthy body weight who is doing forms of activity, so we've got quite a high range for carbs here. If you weren't prepared to do any activity, you could certainly lower that down at the expense of protein and raise up good lean protein in that one to keep you full and stop you eating so many calories. We've got the 20 to 30% fat and the 12 to 20% protein. From an athletic point of view, obviously higher carb and higher protein would leave less room for fat. Otherwise, in a more balanced sort of diet, when you're not doing a lot of exercise, you would probably come in the mid-range for these guys here. So how does fast food stack up? Now before we go on here, we are going to do a task later in the course. We'll pull out some fast food menus and just look at how they stack up compared to an average meal. And that's the first thing we'll note straight away. This is a large Big Mac combo, just a single Big Mac, a large fries and a Coke. Okay. Now for someone of my size and appetite, that hardly touches the side. It's very easy to eat. You can slam it into your body quickly, and I'd probably been eating another burger and some other stuff there. So this is an older figure from 2009. It hasn't actually adapted that much. The gram figures, I checked them recently, are very similar. So what do we get? We get about 1,100 calories from just that. Of that, you can see we get 135 grams of carbs, 31 grams of protein, poor source of protein, obviously, and then 47 grams of fat. And if we go back to 1 gram per kilo for maintenance, then some of the smaller people in our class, some of the smaller females, that's pretty much them. They haven't got a lot more that they can eat over the course of a whole day if they eat that meal there. And as we just mentioned, that's not a lot of food for a lot of people. So, yeah, it's very easy to see how people go way over their fat intake for that day. If you're on a low-fat diet, you can't even have that. It's 40 grams for the whole day, and you've just exceeded it. But the big thing for me here is, what isn't even a big amount of food? 1,100 calories. Well, the average home-cooked meal, if we take something like a decent-sized chicken breast, let's go 2 palms worth of chicken at about 1 inch thick. We're looking probably at about, 40 grams of protein there, a couple of grams of fat really if we take the skin off, so maybe up to 3.5, 4 grams of fat in there. We add, 3 spuds and a cup full of mixed veg, which would make a decent sized meal for most people. You're probably looking at a calorie total there of around 550, maybe as high as 600 calories in the big serve. 600 calories for that amount and volume of food, and that would keep me full. 1,100 calories for just this. And it shows it's just packed in with the almost 50 grams times 9. You're looking at 450 calories of just pure fat. Add on to that 50 grams of sugar, add another 200 calories of just pure sugar. We're up to over 650 calories worth of food, which is bigger than the meal we just had in pure sugar and pure fat. Nobody can tell me that's going to be good for you long term. However, if you look at the macronutrient splits there in terms of carbs, fat, and protein, it's not wholly dissimilar to the numbers that we were looking at before. About 50% carb, we've got about 10-15% protein, and about 20-30% fat, which falls into recommendations. So the problem with fast food is, while it might even hit the macronutrient percentages, it's obviously way too calorie dense, and it's also poor quality proteins and fats, the wrong kind. So from a health perspective, nothing that your body really wants. K-Fry, yeah, we're not going to expect to see anything different. This is the old school 2-piece quarter pack, the old potato and gravy, bread, rolled chips, and a regular pizza. Just a small regular one. Again, 1,100 calories, bam, chucked in there. We probably expect to see a bit more protein, given that it's chicken based. A few less carbs because we don't have all the buns and that kind of stuff in there. I've got a smaller drink going on too. But again, 47 grams of fat just whacked in there. None of it the fat that we're looking for. And a huge whack of calories. And again, if we look at the macro percentage splits there, we're probably better from a protein perspective there. We're probably looking more like 25% protein there. Sorry, probably just under around that 22%. A little bit more in the fat, which is in that average range that we're looking for, and then your carbs down at that sort of 52%. So again, fits into the macronutrient bracket that we've been talking about, but of course way too many calories and the wrong types of calories, and that's where fast food is so dangerous. And when we get into our fast food activities later on, you're going to be shocked. You're actually going to be really shocked at just how bad a lot of these foods are, and we think we can just eat them, periodically. We can eat them a couple of times a week and that kind of stuff, no bad consequences. But man, I'm telling you, there's no substitute for food that you know how it's cooked and what it contains. So the last piece of our lecture here, guys, is about fat and its uses around exercise. And the blunt and honest truth is, while fat plays a role in energy provision, we simply don't have to eat it around exercise. All of us have enough fat to last for hours of exercise. We're not going to run out of fat during an exercise session. We don't absorb fat very quickly, so why would we consider even putting it into our pre, post, or during event snacks and meals? So, thing to consider though, we don't all use fat equally. The more trained your muscles are, the greater your ability to use fat as a fuel. So exercise over time increases our ability to use fat. And we'll talk about more of that in the next lecture, which is nutrition and physical activity, where I lump all of the information we've talked about so far into one place so we can really start to analyse the use of macros during exercise. So basically, the more fat you can free up into the bloodstream as free fatty acids, the more that can enter muscle and the more that you will burn. But that just doesn't happen by accident. You have to drive the demand for fat as a fuel source, and you do that by doing longer duration cardio-based exercise. Again, more on this later, but if you remember at the moment that the longer that exercise go for, the more fat that you're likely to burn total in terms of calories. And this is where a lot of confusion comes in, because people state things like this on websites all the time, and it shows you facts like this. So these are facts from studies, and it shows you that when you're walking, 60% fat is 60% of your energy is provided from fat, and about 40% from your carbs. When you're running at a 10 km/h pace, let's say, 70% of your energy is coming from carbs and 30% is coming from fat burn. On the surface, if we're asking from that information, so what's better to do, people are going to say walking. To burn fat, you're better off walking than running. Which is true if you were prepared to walk as long as it takes to burn the same amount of calories that you would have burned during the run. So the problem with this sort of context and people taking this out of context is that they forget about total calories burned. Running for 20 minutes at the 10 km/h pace, while it burns 70% carbs and only 30% of the fat comes into play there in terms of providing fuel, those 30% of the total calories burned will probably still add up to more than the 60% of fat burned during walking if you did it over the same time period. So I'm talking a 20-minute walk versus a 20-minute hard run. You're going to burn way more calories during the run, and 30% of those calories will probably still equate to far more than 60% of the calories that you burn walking. Now again, a reminder, we don't need fat around exercise because we have heaps stored. And a person with only, say, 12 to 15% body fat, which is low, fairly low levels compared to the average population, you have this many kilojoules, about 371 potatoes worth of energy, just to give you an idea, stored in your body to use for exercise if your body can tap into it. Okay. Now the amount of carbs you can actually store in your system would equate to about 12 potatoes if you've fully filled up all those stores. So we are not running out of fat. We just need to teach our bodies how to be better at using and accessing that fat. More to come on that. So this illustrates the point visually that I was talking about before. If you would go out and run for a certain amount of time at 50% of your VO2 max and then repeat the run at 70% of your VO2 max, then obviously you're going to burn more calories during the 70% effort. You're going to run for the same period of time but at a harder intensity, which will burn more calories. Less of the calories you burn as a percentage will come from fat. That's because you're also working at a higher intensity. We know carbs are used more the more you increase the intensity. However, even though less calories are coming from fat, more calories in total of fat are actually burned than if you were going at a lower intensity. So you can see here in the lower intensity workout, let's say it was 20 minutes at 50% VO2 max, and this person burned 146 calories, and half came from carbs and half came from fat. In the next run, we ramped them up to 70% VO2 max. They burned more calories, 60 more calories total. They burned more carbs than they did fat. But even though they burned less calories as a percentage of fat being used as a fuel, they still burned more fat calories than they would have if they'd run at 50%. So they burned more total calories. A lower percentage of those calories was fat compared to the percentage of calories burned as fat here, but more total calories were burned because there was a larger volume of calories burned total. So what do we take out of that? If you can run. If you can work at a higher intensity and maintain a decent amount of activity in terms of duration, then do that. If you can't, because you're very unfit at this point, then you're better off doing lower and slower intensity stuff, but that means you have to go for much longer before you'll get the same benefit. You also won't challenge the heart and lungs as much in this workout here, which means that your progress will be slower. And herein lies the problem. We've already identified that fit people access fat better. And why is that? Before I talk about these figures here, I'll just give you a little analogy. Let's say a fit person who runs most mornings gets up in the morning and puts on their old running shoes and leaves the house. They start running, their body immediately recognises this as exercise because they do it on a regular basis. The body also realises that they're not just going to run for a minute or 2 minutes. It realises that when this guy Joe, goes running in the morning, he typically runs for an extended period of time. With that knowledge in the bank, the body is far more willing to start trying to access fat stores. So within minutes, it'll start to access fat stores and start to supplement the carbohydrate that he's burning in the initial part of the run with fat. Knowing that he's going to be going for a period of time, it realizes the need to do this so he can keep going harder for longer because his fuel reserves of carbs will last a lot longer if they're being supplemented with fat. In contrast, if a large, fat, unfit person decides that they're going to change their lifestyle, laces up their brand new shoes, puts on their brand new exercise clothes and says, today's the day, walks out of the house and starts running, their body goes, what are you doing? It has no clue what this person is doing because it hasn't done it for so long. It might recognize that, okay, we're putting the body under a bit of a stress here, but he never does this for long, so this will not last long. So no, I'm not going to bother breaking down any fat for you. Yeah, you can just use your residual carbs that you have, and when they run out, game over. But the body's not expecting to do this for long. We haven't made the adjustment in the body in terms of doing the required amount of exercise to make any enzymatic changes within the muscle to even warrant the breakdown of fat, because the body never has to do that. We've trained it to be a fat storing machine, not a fat burning machine. And herein lies the issue. If you look at this shows you the science behind this a little bit. Here's VO2 max on the side, percentage of VO2 max. So this is very low intensity sleep right through to high intensity sprinting, doing something really hard out. And what we know is that the higher the intensity goes, the more carbs that we use. Sure, we can see up here, I would say this is probably pitched at around the 80-85% of VO2 max. We can see that this person would be burning 10% fat and 90% carbs or glucose. No surprises there. Anaerobic glycolysis. We're going anaerobic. Now we know that fat can only be burned in the presence of a constant supply of oxygen, which is aerobic in nature, and the aerobic intensities are down here a bit more. Okay. Now, in the fit person, even working at low intensities here, you can see they're burning a decent amount of fat at 60-40 going on here. And yet, the unfit person on this side at the very, very low levels, we're talking 20-25% intensity, just walking, just being, 50-50 fat and glucose. But look where the split occurs, the 10% fat, 90% glucose split occurs here. Now, I would estimate that at around 50% effort on the VO2 max scale. And that tells you that the unfit person, even when working at 50% of their VO2 max, so they're just starting to tick over and get that exercise going, they're already burning 90% glucose and only 10% fat. And you can see that's going to continue. Anything above that is going to chew through their glucose stores, and they're going to hit the wall very quickly. And they may only be able to continue for a couple of minutes. So knowing this information and being armed with this information is important when dealing with these kind of people, because our expectations should be lowered in terms of the amount of exercise they can do that is meaningful. They should also be aware that they can't just start these programs that people put out and say, right, off you go, hour run. It'll never happen. If they have the willpower and determination, they might get through at a waddle, but the reality is their system is not attuned to burning fat yet. How do you get your system attuned to burning fat? You need to train that muscle. And that's going to take a sustained period of daily exercise. We're talking probably 10 to 14 days of regular exercise where you go out and you build and you build and you build before your body starts to go, hey, you know what? I think this is going to be something that my body's going to do regularly. Maybe I should start making those changes that will allow this other abundance of fuel that I have in my system access to the muscle and use some of that. And you'll start to see the changes occur. And from that point, you will see meaningful changes in fat being used as a fuel source, ability to exercise for longer, and all those types of things. So, when do we edit around exercise? The answer is we don't. Fat should be consumed sparingly prior to any exercise. In fact, within the 2-hour window before and after exercise, just try to cut fat out. It has slow absorption. You're not going to run out of fat in an exercise session, and you certainly wouldn't try and refuel it, because more importantly than just trying to eat food around exercise. We're trying to get carbohydrate to the muscle, we're trying to get protein to the muscle post-training, and fat's simply going to blunt that response. It's going to stop it getting there in good time and the times that you need it. So it's more of an impedance. So eat it in small portions throughout the day, think about where it's coming from, and make sure that we're getting the required mono and polyunsaturated fats that you actually have to think about putting into your diet. They're not just turning up in everything that we eat. And from an exercise perspective, avoid fat in the lead up to, during, and immediately after exercise, because it will blunt the availability of the other more key nutrients for exercise and recovery at those times. Alright team, I realise quite a lengthy sort of video there, but that's everything. That's everything covered in a nutshell effectively. Our next step from here is to combine all of the findings we've had so far from carbs, fats and protein and really just look at the exercise relevant stuff. So we'll talk more about fitness, we'll talk more about fueling with carbs, fats and protein around exercise, we'll talk exact amounts, we'll talk timings to get the best out of your trainings and the best out of your recovery. Thanks for listening in guys, and we'll catch you next time.